Since we're all here, right? Okay, ladies and gentlemen, I just want to thank you for coming. The Roseau Public Library and the Greater Northwest Regional Library is proud to bring you events like this. We're always looking for local talent, local authors, and tonight we have Scott Cameron, a poet formerly from Red Lake Falls, is going to perform for us. Thank you for coming.
Thank you, Ryan. Okay, so I think one of the most difficult things with poetry presentations is that we don't know whether to clap or not. So I think we should all make an agreement right now that if I'm done with a poem, we'll just do one clap all together, and then we won't have to worry about it. So when I get to the end of the poem, I'll say one clap, and then we'll go. Okay, so let's just try it one time. Are you ready? One clap. Got it. Good. So that's, now we're not going to have to worry about that for the rest of the poetry. Okay, hi, as Ryan said, my name is Scott Cameron. I grew up in Red Lake Falls. I've had kind of a very strange journey to get here today. I mean, I graduated from Red Lake Falls, and then I went to the University of North Dakota and got a degree there. And then I went to the University of Oslo in Norway. And then I went to the University of Minnesota Law School, where I met my wife, who's a Swede. And we went out to New York. And we then eventually moved to London in 1997. We had our 2 children in Connecticut. And then they were raised in England. We also live outside of Karlstad, Sweden. So the children are bilingual. I speak Swedish, and my wife is actually from Karlstad, Sweden. So a big link to the sort of Scandinavian heritage that you have around here. I'm going to read some poetry for you, but I have to tell you that I'm like a lot of people, and that is that poetry reading for me creates a very negative connotation, because the first time I went to a poetry reading, I was 16 years old, and my sister was dating a professor at St. Benedict's College. Terry, that better not go on the... I'll just say, I went with my sister to a poetry reading, and the person started off by saying to us, you know, after each poem, I expect you to permit an impregnated pause, after which time you may react, whether that's laughter or applause or what have you. But please allow at least 5 seconds after the poem. Whoa, and I looked around me and I saw all these academics, and I said to myself, well, by the time this 1 hour was up, I really had lost the will to live. And so my goal with you guys today is that I'm going to keep this very short, and I want, my ultimate goal is obviously to communicate, but the second right behind that is I don't want any of you to die of boredom or to lose the will to live. Okay. So to make that interesting then, I'm only going to read about 5 poems and tell you some stories in between. And these 5 poems are each going to be, just think of them as separate dots that are talking about a different element of humanness. The way the book is structured, there's 8 different sections in it, and both are, it's try to group things into where you can find categories that people can relate to. I'm just going to do 5 little dots for you and tell you a little bit of the story behind it. And the reason I'm going to do that, I'm going to explain now. Poetry is still really relevant for a very specific reason, and that's because our brains are so screwed up and so strange. Because if you look at a human brain, it weighs about 3 pounds. Inside of that brain, there are over 100 billion neurons. Those neurons are capable of 100 trillion connections. That's an amazing amount of circuitry in our brain. But to make things more complicated, we have 2 hemispheres of the brain. And these 2 hemispheres are so different that they make the odd couple look like identical twins. Because the right side of the brain, well, I'll start with the left side of the brain, controls the right side of the body. The left side of the brain then also controls logic, linear thinking, reasoning, language, thinking through words, etc. And then you go over to the right side of the brain, weighs the exact same amount, but it doesn't have a language center. It has a small language center. But what it basically does is feels for us. It gives us nonverbal communications. It watches for nonverbal cues. It's where our imagination is stored. It's where our intuition is. It's why when you're talking to me, right, I'll give you one more thing. Between the 2 hemispheres, there's a neuron superhighway, so that those 2 brains are talking to each other all the time. So right now, when you're looking at me, your left brain is analyzing what I'm saying, putting the words together sequentially, and then trying to come up with a meaning. Your right brain is going, this guy's kind of weird. I don't like his hair. His suit, why does he have a suit on? He should take that suit jacket off, etc. He looks kind of funny, etc. Do I really trust this guy? He kind of makes me nervous. Those 2 things are unfortunately happening at the exact same time. And in the last 10 years, we've learned so much about the brain that we know that if you hooked up these sensors to our brain, you'd see that both sides are actually working at the same time. That's how we process information as human beings. So when you try to describe something as complex as emotions, feelings, thoughts, etc., they don't lend themselves to your left brain understanding it. In other words, it's very difficult for me to put into a logical sequence a bunch of words that describe love. So when it comes to poetry, you all of a sudden have to find a way to get over into both hemispheres at the same time. And that's why T.S. Eliot said a really important quote. He said that genuine poetry can communicate before it's understood. That's a weird statement if you think about it. Genuine poetry can communicate before it's understood. And what he's really saying is that when you really get it right, the right side of the brain gets it. Sometimes you have to go back and go, why did it get it? And that happens to us a lot of times with certain events in our lives. And you'll see in some of the dots, there'll be an event which triggered a right brain reaction, and I've written a poem, which then is the logic, trying to put into words what I felt. But without that right brain reaction, that poem would have never happened. But that's where most of the poetry should be. I'll give you one more quick, before I start reading, insight into this, and that's that what is good poetry? What do we generally think of as good poetry? They've been trying to figure that out for ages. And what is the poetry that does the best job of appeasing both sides of our brain, especially when it's talking about feelings and emotions? Well, they did a study, and they had 400 readers come in and read a body of English sonnets, primarily the Shakespearean sonnets. Then they looked at Japanese haiku. And the Japanese haiku was obviously translated to English, and there's some difficulty translating haiku to English because of differences in the language, in the fundamental structure of Japanese.